The Puwersa ng Bayaning Atleta or PBA party list calls for the crafting of comprehensive guidelines defining the liability of motorcycle taxis, especially during accidents. PBA party list Representative Migs Nograles says accountability and safety must be prioritized over convenience in these services. To tell us more about their appeal is Representative Margarita Nograles, live here in the studio. Good afternoon, Representative Nograles, and welcome to Traffic Center.
Good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me to talk about this very crucial issue that we have to address nowadays, especially when it comes to this pilot study and when it comes to legislation, when it comes to this motorcycle taxi vehicle law.
So, ma'am, let's get right to it. How would you assess the current state of motorcycle taxis here in the country? Would you say they're safe and reliable?
You know, there are studies. We did the hearing last week, and they were saying that their safety records are pretty high, but there are accidents that they have reported.
Of course.
But there is this problem that I am trying to address. That when there are accidents, although there are insurances covered and they have set guidelines to safety measures, we don't know who to blame once these accidents happen, which is very inevitable. So when death occurs or any physical injury occurs, we don't know who to blame. Is it going to be the driver? Or is it going to be the company, which is the TNC? Because as a TNC, under the Public Service Act as amended, they are not considered as public utility vehicles. So that means they're like private utility vehicles, like any other car that we
You mentioned there are current guidelines.
Yes.
Are you saying there's a need to update these guidelines?
Yes. During that hearing, I really asked LTFRB,
right?
LTFRB, to please include these guidelines to include liability into the guidelines to know, for the public to know, not just the safety, but also who can we question, who can we go after for any injuries or death that occurs.
So liability is just one of the gaps. There's a lot to unpack. How does the Congress address the gaps of these motorcycle taxi pilot studies so far?
Well, now we have a technical working group, which includes the DOTR and all these other groups, and that is why there is this pilot study. And there's this call, this is what I'm saying, this is call for expansion and added players among the three players that's already there. But then if we don't address this liability issue, then how can we study this even more? If they don't set a set of guidelines for this liability, then it's something that we can't really study and craft a bill and legislation that addresses all these other factors.
Right. We heard, ma'am, that you have reservations in adding more stakeholders. Is this why?
Yes, because how can you add stakeholders when we don't even know who to run after to begin with, right? There are different aspects of the law which require diligence. It's very complicated. If you're a common carrier, you are required to do extraordinary diligence. But then there was also a memorandum circular that was given 2015 that these TNTs or transport providers can only do ordinary diligence. So now you don't know what type of diligence would be required for these drivers.
Can you explain that a little more? When you say ordinary diligence, what does that mean?
So ordinary diligence, by definition of law, is just acting like a good father of family. So you just make sure that nothing else would happen. You took care of everything. You did the oversight. Extraordinary diligence, with the term extra, you have to make sure that everything else from plan A to step A to step Z, you have covered to really ensure that you provided every measure for the safety of the passengers. So now, because there are two various laws, what diligence would be required of these drivers?
So with that in mind, what do you recommend to create a just and reasonable guidelines in terms of liability?
At the end of the day, they are common carriers. And under the Civil Code, you have to have extraordinary diligence because you are carrying a public passenger for a fee. And they have to ensure that you have that extraordinary diligence. But again, who do you blame for lack of a better term, when an accident happens. Because now they can't be considered as a public utility vehicle. So there's no certificate of public convenience. And there are no regulations or whatsoever, and there's just guidelines that we have right now. So is it going to be these TNCs, the 3 players right now?
Right.
Or is it the driver because he's the one who owns the motorcycle? So there's that gap,
Right.
and there's that overlap.
Actually, ma'am, in your opinion, do you think it should motorcycle taxis should be considered private or public vehicles?
They should be public because if they're private, and because our laws that we have, if you're private, we have the motor registered motor vehicle act, if I
Right.
believe. Then it's the one who's registered with the private vehicle that will be liable for any accidents.
Right.
Kawawa naman yung drivers natin.
Of course.
Diba? So what will happen to these TNCs who are essentially booking apps, right? So what? They can just do that and just blame everything on the driver.
Right.
At least making them public utility, they will be now regulated, and even the fees will be regulated, and they get the franchise and they have to get the certificate of public convenience.
Right. I wish we could talk about this more, but we're running out of time.
Yes.
Is there anything else you want to say before we go?
Well, I know. This is me not saying that I don't support this. Of course, I support this whole pilot study. It's good for the economy. It's good for the drivers. I just want to ensure the safety of the public and also ensure that our drivers are also protected and they won't be held liable for things that are beyond their control. I can talk about it more. I talk about this on my social media page, if I could just plug it.
Go ahead.
So it's Attorney Migs Nograles on Facebook and on TikTok, and I talk about all these things, and I will explain this even more because of the complication of the laws.
Thank you, Representative Nograles.